Welcome, greetings everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We are System Change, Not Climate Change, a global eco-socialist network. I'm sorry, we're not global. We have a global outlook, but we are basically North American and Central American. My name is Maura Stevens, and I'm speaking to you today from Costa Rica. We are glad to host this in it's our latest in our series of webinars that we started last year, in which we have been talking about a variety of intersectional eco-socialist issues, including, and perhaps primarily, how climate/eco-socialist activists and workers or labor organizers and activists can be working together, because together we're so much more powerful than if we silo ourselves. We've had numerous webinars on that, as well as on China's engine of environmental catastrophe with SCNCC's own Richard Smith. And we've spoken about eco-agriculture with Grace Gershuni. And just recently, we spoke last month about the PRO Act that is protecting our rights to organize. The PRO Act is a bill up in the United States, and those of you who are not familiar with it should get familiar with it, especially if you're interested in a Green New Deal. So please see our YouTube page, which we'll put the link to that in our chat, and also please check out our website, systemchangenotclimatechange.org, and our Facebook page. We are really welcoming of new voices, new thoughts, new ideas, and we have numerous ways for you to connect via listservs and the social media. Find out more there. So today I'd like to, first of all, thank our small volunteer team. We're completely unfunded and a network. We are not an NGO. Steve Willett, please highlight yourself for a second, is our web guru. And he's running today's event. And Ted Franklin, my colleague, will be running the Q&A with Sabrina and Patrick after they give their presentations. And I'd especially like to thank our newest member today. For the first time ever, System Change, Not Climate Change is welcoming a summer intern, Alex Hartzog, who is here, compliments of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College. And today's his first day on the job. So welcome, Alex. And we hope that you'll be writing a lot for our website. He'll be researching and writing. And so look for the byline, Alex Hartzog, during the summer. It's mind-boggling to imagine this, but this is the 26th year in a row that the world nations will be meeting to discuss climate change and how they can best respond to it. 26 years of bullshit. COP26 will be held this year in November in Glasgow, Scotland, if indeed it's held anywhere physically, given COVID and other problems plaguing the world. But what happens there will be the same old business as usual, we have no doubt, because capitalism rules. And capitalism drives the climate discussion, just as capitalism drives the climate catastrophe. Today, to talk about COP26 and how we might organize above, beyond, instead of it, and also to talk about a global eco-socialist response to climate change and how we can globally get together and force radical change that we all know we need, are two of the great eco-socialist thinkers, writers, and educators. We're very honored to have with us today Patrick Bond of South Africa and Sabrina Fernandes of Brazil, who will be talking about these important topics with us, just a little bit touching on the very important overarching need for climate action on a global scale. You can read more about them in the YouTube paragraph below, or if you've gotten our invitation, you will have read their Very impressive biographies. We don't have time to go into them now, so I'm just going to turn it over to them. Patrick Bond will speak first. Sabrina will follow him, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you for joining us, and here's Patrick Bond.
We have a little opening we always use, Amandla, aware to power to the people, but you'll forgive me, I'm going to do power to the PowerPoint. So this is just to keep myself straight as I do this for my students, the University of the Western Cape School of Government. And really the ability to critique global governance, especially the climate scene, is very, very important. We've got at the top right picture I'll unpack, which is the Brazil, Russia, no, there's no Russia, there's Brazil, India, China, South Africa with the US, BASIC and the US, that becomes part of the story of the malformed GloboGov that I want to focus on, because yeah, it's COP26, as Maura has done with this graphic, will confirm the world is on fire with very little prospect for what I might call a non-reformist reform, drawing on the socialist labor theorist Andre Gortz and many others. I mean, going back to Trotsky and the transitional program, we're always looking for these reforms that really break through the logic, the underlying logic of the system. I want to argue that the two core processes in capitalist global climate policy, the technical fixes and market mechanisms, are going to result in this graphic becoming true. And in fact, I'm just drawing here from exactly what Maura said the last, or is it Ted, the last of the system change, not climate change discussions, where Joe Biden was featured by US labor activists thinking through whether some of the concessions made domestically are at all useful, or whether they delegitimize even the idea of climate justice. Speaking of delegitimization, this is where Greta Thunberg is really leading us, isn't it? It's in speaking to the World Economic Forum on the 26th of January, describing the capitalist strategies in these very explicit terms, creating new loopholes, failing to connect the dots, cheating tactics, right? Whoever's best at packaging and selling their message wins. And that's what I fear that I've seen in at least the last two kind of weekend-long conferences preparing for the COP26. I might as well, you know, use some of the names. They're great comrades at 350.org and at climate at Global Justice Now. Some of these sponsoring groups doing this work really haven't figured out if they are going to follow Greta in this very strong delegitimization of the capitalist strategies, which in aggregate means, I think, you delegitimize the UN as a global capitalist state apparatus for climate policy. And then the day after, she said this very clearly, we got exactly the essence of these warnings in Joe Biden's statement, where he focuses on the net zero global emissions, and the United States will exercise leadership. And of course, that means, you know, money, right? We need to align financial flows. I want to come back to that, because that to me is where the eco-socialist critique will be very strong. Now, there are critiques already from Indigenous Environmental Network about the market-based solutions and, you know, kind of Frankenstein technologies that we'll look at, and the failure to cut emissions at source. Food and Water Watch condemning the Biden-Kerry plan for the failure to ban oil drilling and fracking. And indeed, it's that market strategy where the net zero is not going to be achieved through massive cuts locally, but buying the right to continue polluting in the wealthy countries and offsetting that by preventing industrialization that relies on fossil fuels in the South. So this is the famous offsetting or carbon trading or emissions markets. And Al Gore really promoted this in the Kyoto Protocol. The 1997 Conference of the Parties, the Kyoto Protocol, included a US promise to join so long as these carbon markets would allow US companies to continue polluting, but to privatize the air, right, to buy the right to pollute. And Gore, in his Nobel Peace Prize winning film and book, says the European Union has adopted this US innovation and is making it work effectively there. So we'll come back to that. It's not true. And then, of course, as I said, just market, but also tech fixes. This is the sort of Bill Gates strategies, nuclear or the carbon capture and storage to sequester carbon, to capture it under a power plant, or to find bionic plants to suck it up, right, through natural sequestration. Through putting sulfur dioxide in the air, getting a kind of a block to slow down the warming process, or dropping iron filings into the ocean to create algae blooms to sequester. These are the sort of Dr. Strangelove or Frankenstein sorts of false solutions that are coming from the engineers. Very few of these are really panning out. It's not that it's impossible to solve a global problem with global environmental governance, because we did actually, the elites did. They realized that the ozone hole, as it widened out, was becoming extremely destructive. And so this is a function of chlorofluorocarbons before 1987 just being produced in our underarm deodorants or refrigerators. And so they did actually something that we need them to do with greenhouse gases, which is to ban the production. And then by 96, the solution was kind of clear, and then the rise in the size of the ozone hole ceased, and the amount of Dobson units of ozone declined. So we do have a sort of precedent for saying, yeah, you can actually find a way to cap and then decline and ban the offending pollutant. Now, that's not what happened, of course, when we come now to the COP26 and its major precedent, the COP21, the Paris Climate Agreement. So let's quickly remind ourselves what we needed to have happen in the COP21. What did the activists, what did the social forces, the environmental leaders around the world demand? Well, that the Paris Climate Agreement should sufficiently, ambitiously, with binding constraints, cut emissions, and do so in a way that's fairly distributed. Who can dispute the need to make the adequate cuts? Accountability mechanisms, including penalties, right? Courts or fines or taxes or border adjustment taxes. Carbon taxation, of course, should be judiciously applied, because we know from Ecuador in 2019 or Paris, and then in fact the rural France in 2018 through 2020, the danger of a reactionary, of a regressive tax that creates social resistance, and to dispense with the carbon markets. And then to make sure there's polluter pay responsibilities. A standard neoliberal economic strategy, environmental economics, says, if you pollute, you pay to clean up the loss and damage, and compensate as well, not just for damage, but the unused carbon space. And have a just transition that's rich in jobs, as was discussed at the last SCNCC thing. The climate-friendly technology that needs to be transferred without intellectual property reminds us of the debate going on in the World Trade Organization today about COVID-19 vaccines and treatments, which we desperately need off monopoly patent. And right now it's Angela Merkel mainly standing in the way, but of course the Biden administration plays tricks with its commitment now to withdraw from IP. The military, the maritime, the air transport sectors essentially left out of the Paris Climate Agreement, not properly dealt with. And of course, oil companies, which continue to extract and to explore for more fossil fuels, even though these are really unburnable assets or stranded assets and should be considered accordingly. Now, these are the mandates. Now, how many of these simple, clear, obvious mandates, if you're serious about global climate governance, were actually implemented? I think you're all paying attention because that's the correct answer. Yes, there was none of them, right? This was a complete failure. It was bullshit, according to the lead climate scientist, James Hansen, as he looked at what had happened. And you can see this now when you do even a very conservative organization, Carbon Tracker, which doesn't really rigorously look at what's going on, but just takes for granted what states say they're doing. But they say by the end of 2020, when you're supposed to update your commitments, very few, 39 countries had done so, 119 had not. And then even today, it's now nearly 6 months later, 101 countries still have not updated their NDC, nationally determined contributions. We know from the one that we have here in South Africa that it's a total scam, and I'll be happy to share the critiques if anyone's interested in these sort of NDC updates that are coming along. And so we really need penalties, because the Carbon Tracker, the Climate Action Tracker, shows that we're heading towards between 2.1 and 3.9, probably 3.9. And I'll just quickly dwell on this one critical question of accountability, because it's not that radical to say that you need to have a penalty, a carbon tax or sanctions of some sort against the economies that are not making the sufficient cuts, because they're therefore able to produce below genuine costs. They're not internalizing externalities. So even a sort of center-left economist like Joe Biden, Joe Stiglitz says, yeah, we've got to actually have sanctions against the United States. Now, he didn't argue this under Trump, but actually in 2006. Naomi Klein in 2016, when Trump was elected in 2017, when he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, said we desperately need to get penalties, sanctions, and we need a sort of BDS USA. And even the criminal right-wing president of France earlier in the last decade, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was of course worried about his own quite nervous French manufacturers in this competitive battle, internecine battle, he endorsed this kind of an event. Now, I want to go even further back to give you a sense of the power relations there that made it impossible for countries, even EU, to impose these kinds of sanctions, because it's a whole bunch of them. It's not just Barack Obama in the middle, but Jacob Zuma was there, Lula from Brazil, and Wen Jiabao and Manmohan Singh. So you have basic Brazil, South Africa, India, China in league with the United States at the critical moment where a profound failure to grapple with climate crisis was evident. In fact, this was the unambitious, non-binding, and no penalty kind of deal that Bill McKibben from 350.org just described, I think appropriately, a league of super polluters and wannabe super polluters blew up the UN, right? And so the critical question in this blowing up is, do we see here an imperial climate power, the US, and 4 sub-imperial powers, that is, working, as Rui Mauro Marini, the Brazilian, put it, in an antagonistic cooperation to ensure that their own corporates and industrial polluters could continue. Now, this wasn't unopposed, because on the floor, our colleagues, our comrades in the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance said, no, this is suicide, right? 2 degrees is suicide, and no to climate colonialism or climate genocide. In fact, G77 and China, the kind of biggest single bloc, had an extraordinary man, Lumumba Diaping. Next to him is Mitika Mwenda from Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. But Lumumba Diaping put it very openly in his discussions. He was in a taped meeting, and he said, look, we've been asked to sign a suicide pact. $10 billion on offer is not enough to buy the coffins. Copenhagen Accord is worse than no deal. I'd rather die with my dignity intact than sign a deal that channels my people into a furnace, right? He was using the Holocaust metaphor there. What is Obama going to tell his daughters about their relatives' lives, right? Are they not worth anything? Very, very undiplomatic, extraordinary. Now that language is now a little bit more common. We're losing the fight, according to UN Secretary General Manuel de Oliveira Gutierrez, because the status quo is suicide. But by saying that, by using Holocaust metaphor, Lumumba Diaping was never allowed back in. In fact, nor was the 2 years, was it the subsequent year, in 2010, at the COP16 in Cancun, the Bolivian ambassador to the UN was not allowed back after similarly sort of standing up and saying this climate policy designed by the US and its allies is not going to work. And similarly in 2012 in Warsaw, Yeb Sanyo, the COP19 ambassador from the Philippines and now head of Greenpeace Asia, similarly has not been allowed back. So once you kind of go inside and you speak truth to power like that, you have a problem. Now, the problem isn't climate denialism. This was the period under Trump, but it's a new one I want to just flag for you because it's so critical to understanding capitalist logic. It's climate debt denialism. It's the refusal to acknowledge that polluter pays idea. And Todd Stern, US State Department envoy during the Obama years, who was more or less managing, as we know from WikiLeaks and the leaked emails that he sent to Hillary Clinton, we absolutely recognize the historic role of the US in putting the emissions up there. But the sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I just categorically reject that. So that's the essence of the capitalist let's say, internalization of the externalities, the failure to even adopt a sort of environmental economic strategy, just denialism, climate debt denialism. And of course, the US, as well as China, Japan, depending on what what measure you use, per capita or absolute, when you start the measures. South Africa does also rank fairly high on that list of climate debtors, and it's a critical question that we're raising in this slide. Now, the rebuttal from a Hillary Clinton might be, no, we've got $100 billion a year from you. That's what she promised in Copenhagen, and that too is bullshit. And even the New York Times in 2018 is acknowledging that it wasn't just Trump canceling it. The fund of hope is a fund of hopelessness. So that green climate fund that was supposedly going to help marshal 100 billion in public and private funding just isn't working. So then it's back to the carbon trading, isn't it? So let me quickly remind you that the capitalist strategy here is to gamble, to allow banks to set up markets that will supposedly internalize these externalities. They get managed by the degree to which you can set a floor of the lowest price. So the EU is doing that. But look at how chaotic and catastrophic the reliance upon pricing carbon through the market has been. When Gore says the EU emissions trading scheme is working, it isn't. By 2008, it was just collapsing. What also happened in late 2008? In other words, the carbon market as a commodification of the right to pollute follows quite closely other financial speculative bubbles. And we've seen this through the 2010s and then back into 2020 as well. And of course, in 2018, the EU did try to put a floor, and there's a price now close to 50 euros a ton. But you can just see from last April, do you remember the awful crashes in world financial markets that were going on then? Well, 38% and 52% over an 8-month period in the price of the right to pollute. And it's no better in California, I'm afraid, Ted and other colleagues there. The once unpopular carbon credits have emerged as a major speculative commodity, right? The world's best performing commodity. And the Financial Times lauding the potential to have private volunteer offset market, and this is partly managed by, or will be by Mark Carney, the former British central banker. And so there's a lot of hype about it, but then people begin to realize, if you want to look at that in detail, the Coldplay farce. Remember the band Coldplay saying, oh, we'll offset our emissions on our rock and roll tour by buying forests. So when you start doing these and you look at them, they turn out to be fake. And so these are papal indulgences of the Middle Ages. The trouble with carbon pricing is two very fine sociologists from University of California, Santa Barbara, Matto Mildenberger and Leah Stokes put it, mean the supply of pollution permits has been consistently higher. The price to pollute is too low and likely to remain that way. And as I say, Carney's trying to set it up, and there are lots of efforts all around the world. But I'll just close by just reminding you that our eco-socialist critique of letting banksters solve the world's worst problem when they can't even run their own financial markets makes no sense. And this terrible unevenness in pricing carbon, where here in South Africa, we're only pricing it at 43 cents a ton at minimum, and in Sweden, 132. That's a little bit more reasonable. But then, of course, the other big question is, will there be justice? And I'll just close with that question of justice, partly because the Durban Group for Climate Justice from Durban, South Africa, attracted a few dozen comrades from around the world to debate what is wrong with this capitalist strategy. Now that's back in 2004, and without going into all of the details as to why offsetting and emissions trading is useless and counterproductive, suffice to say, this has been a critique for some time, and Annie Leonard's wonderful film called The Story of Cap and Trade, you can download it. A couple of million people have helped to open this up in 2009 to distinguish between kind of big green eco-modernizationists on the one hand and the climate justice movement and eco-socialists on the other who reject this. So I'll conclude by saying, no, come to South Africa. If you want to see some of this, you can see it visually and on our websites, particularly aidc.org.za, where the Million Climate Jobs Just Transition had begun over a decade ago. But the contestations, which I know Sabrina in Brazil is grappling with as well, contestations where very strong radical trade unionists from the mine workers, or that's Joseph Matunjwa, AMCU, the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, or Pakimile Hlue Majola from the Metal Workers Union, or Zwelenzima Vavi from the the biggest federation, South African Federation of Trade Unions. Look, they've all got the most profound eco-socialist and just transition, or radical Green New Deal, whatever your terminology is, They've all got that. But actually getting it into practice, I'll just mention this kind of problems I think Sabrina will describe, depends on some factors: the speed, the scale, the scope, the space, and the role of the state. And for eco-socialists, this is our opportunity to think about the real contradictions when you have socialists from the labor movement in these three comrades' cases who are trying to figure out, do they want to speed up the transition, or because they know that it will be unjust, slow the transition? So speed is one factor. What do we do with scale? Do we want a national agency, ESCOM, or in Sabrina's case, I think it'll be Petrobras, or do we want decentralized, small-scale, embedded, and more community-based and worker self-managed, municipal-based energy systems? Then we've got the scope, and one scope is whether you're simply economistic and protecting your dirty energy jobs, or you have a more expansive post-capitalist perspective. And the space is particularly tricky because most of the coal mining jobs and the jobs in the coal-fired power plants are in one part of the country, and really some of the best sun and wind would be elsewhere. And then finally, the question of the state. And should we try to restore the power and the potential of ESCOM as a socialist vehicle, or has it gone too far? Corruption, but also its coal addiction. So the Climate Justice Coalition pulls some of this together with 350 and the SAFTU movement. And finally, what we call it, the Climate Justice Charter is being pushed into Parliament. There's a nice book there for free for downloading, The Climate Crisis. And that charter is one of the strongest documents I've seen in the world to really try to overcome these internal contradictions. The manifestos are there. The anger and the protest is on the ground. We haven't found a way yet to put them together, but I think that's what the eco-socialist agenda has got to be, thinking all of that through. Thanks, comrades.
Do I go ahead, Ted, or do you say something now?
Please do, please do.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you, Patrick. That was amazing. Like lots of information on what's going on here. The reason why our conversation here today is also talking about like an agenda that's beyond COP26 is basically because we have realized that these are yearly gatherings that have amounted to nothing, absolutely nothing. And really bad news for us is that even though every year social movements, they come out and organize sort of a parallel event, what happens most of the time is that sometimes we get a march going. So there's a demonstration, perhaps at the beginning, perhaps at the end, perhaps both. And we talk to each other. So we can actually connect, we can exchange ideas. This is positive, but this is also not dependent on the COP calendar. We don't need COP to be able to talk to each other and exchange our strategies and know more about how to connect what's happening around the world, right? The reality is that the COP calendar has actually imprisoned us a little bit for a really long time. It's when things are approaching COP that people start talking about it again. And this is changing a bit more nowadays. Now you have youth movements, you have more people getting involved, you have more voices from the global south coming forward and talking about how this urgency is actually real. So we shouldn't just wait until the end of the year, November, every year to talk about it in some place around the world. So things are changing. So for us, it's really important to make sure that we don't get held hostage anymore about by the COP calendar as well as the COP agenda. I remember I wrote a report 10 years ago, actually, on the delegations that were going to COP, different COPs in different countries, right? So for example, we would have official delegations from the countries. They would come already with Shell inside of the delegation. So we're not talking here about like for the UNFCCC, you have these registrations. So you can be registered as an environmental NGO, or you can be registered perhaps as a youth organization or as a business and industry NGO, the bingos. But we're not talking about Shell going as a bingo. We're talking about Shell going inside of a country's delegation, including Brazil's delegation at the time. So this is quite worrisome when we know that they're coming out there and they're making all of this fuss about making resolutions and coming out with accords, when we know that the fossil fuel industry is not sitting there at the bleachers. The fossil fuel industry is right there with a pen in their hands, to make sure that they can pencil in whatever that they want when it comes to these resolutions and these agreements. And this is part of the reason why they have never really worked so far. We could remember, for example, COP in Cancun, where there was the beginning of a conversation about waiving patents and changing the property rights system around green technology. And that conversation started bubbling, and then it kind of completely got scrapped away. And it never really came back to the table. You have different movements trying to talk about it, but it never really comes back to the table, particularly because when you look, for example, in terms of the electricity sector, and you look at the amount of patents that have been filed up to last year, up to 2020, you're going to find out that when they're talking about renewable energy, the majority of the patents have been filed by Mitsubishi, the car maker. The second biggest player right there is General Electric. So we're talking about large corporations, and the majority of these patents, they could be actually hailed as signs of great innovation about, yes, green technology, and that's going to save us, which could go right into the path of what Patrick was denouncing here. So these false solutions, talking about technology that's not viable yet, technology that has a lot of complicated consequences that people are not willing to deal with. And unfortunately, this year, Bill Gates did us the unfavor of bringing this back with a lot of strength because of his most recent book on the matter. But what we find out actually is that these patents are being filed, and they're being filed mostly to serve particular trends in green technology and green business. So we're looking about individual electric vehicles. We're talking about how industries that are already very polluting, or industries that want to keep growing, so they want to be extracting more resources and things like that, they want to green themselves. And based on that, we're going to get situations that are really bizarre. For example, in Brazil, agribusiness going on the cover of magazine saying that, well, agribusiness is now very green because we have a lot of solar panels in our farms. And we have, yes, we are growing soy, and there's a lot of agrochemicals, and we have a lot of fertilizers, and it's all about the commodity market. But no, we have solar panels, and things are more and more automated. So there's this idea that we could have this capitalist eco-modern dream that could become a reality, and you don't really have to deal with these other things. And unfortunately, that has been the rule so far. If anyone has actually been to COP, not the parallel events that we are part of as social movements, but to the actual COP area where they let social movements register, and you have those little stands that kind of looks like a huge like market stand, actually. Like, so you're going to have each country, and they're going to do their greenwashing. So for example, Brazil deforestation was rising, and the Temer government a couple of years ago, so in Bonn, 2017, the Brazilian stand there was all about how Brazil was doing so well on biodiversity. So these countries, they come forth and they do their own greenwashing over there. And then you're going to have members of social movements with an opportunity to speak about something and giving a workshop about something, but that never actually influences the actual conversation. Like the part of the state leaders doing something and committing to something around that. And it's actually it is really odd when you look into this, is that it seems that the current system is a system that's absolutely designed to make sure that we think decisions are being made during this moment when they already get there and they already have things pretty much organized. This is why when Biden comes out, and Biden is trying to make a stance right now saying that, well, I'm very different from Trump. So yes, let's get back on Paris Accord. Let's do this like leaders summit. And this for me is quite symbolic of how much we need to talk about imperialism and how the US is an imperialist power, because Biden just decides, no, I'm going to do my own climate summit. And then he brings all these people forward. And of course, the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, he comes and he lies through his teeth about it. And the next day, Biden is cutting funds. Again, connected to climate change. So it's about actually just making sure they get legitimized to keep business as usual, and they get rid of the more radical parts of it. This means also that one of our challenges is to make sure that we extend the conversation. We've been dealing, yes, with climate denialism, and Patrick has brought up the problem of actual climate debt. Because when we talk about climate debt, this brings into a conversation of political economy. We are required, whenever we're talking about climate debt, to look into geopolitics. We are required to look into colonization, which countries have taken the most, and what are the patterns of development in all of these places. And one of the reasons that we need to bring in that conversation here as well is that it is not enough to just say, believe the science. I know that because of climate denialism, it kind of has become a motto in part of the movement. Like we've seen Greta talk about it. We need to believe the science, believe the science. And I think it's interesting that most of the time when people are talking believe the science, we're talking straight up hard sciences and the numbers connected to carbon metrics, connected to how much greenhouse gases we actually have accumulating in the atmosphere. But when we're talking, for example, about the social sciences, letting people know that, okay, but we're not going to be able to fix this without taking bigger social ecological matters into account as well, then no, this is too complicated. You're actually just stalling the conversation, and it's going to be harder to bring conservative allies that we need to fight this problem. And it's quite sad because like we have like great scientists in like from from climatology actually dealing with this, and they reject very much whenever we bring into a critique of capitalism and a critique of these geopolitical inequalities, because they think that if we're going to have a really broad front to bring people together to find a solution, then you need to depoliticize certain aspects in order not to alienate potential allies. When in fact, our job as eco-socialists is to make sure this is all at the root cause of the problem, that we do not have the privilege of saying something is different from another thing, as if we were dealing with just a little bubble of greenhouse gas emissions. If there's a little tap, and it's just about controlling the tap of emissions. But there's a lot more things involved here. And I think something that makes it quite clear and also adds to our urgency is all this conversation about going from a commodity boom into a commodity super cycle. So earlier this year, January 2021, Deutsche Bank came out with a report about it. I just wrote out the title of the report so I wouldn't forget. So it's Commodities 2021 Outlook, Cyclical Recovery Meets a Green Tipping Point. So this came out in January. And ever since, we have like more and more reports, and we have also news and more analysis about what this new super cycle means. And this super cycle is being treated as something really positive because it's tied to green growth. So this idea that what we're going to get out of this is, we're going to bring more power to our economies. The markets are going to benefit, but look at that, we're also saving the environment. We're also tackling climate change because it is about these commodities connected to the greener industry or creation of greener jobs. This, of course, brings us into a conversation of geopolitics and these unequal exchanges that we have. So both the unequal economic exchange, how certain countries are always underdeveloped at the periphery of capitalism. Like sometimes I use the language at the margins of the system, and other countries keep getting richer. But also this means an unequal ecological exchange, because we are having a transfer of resources. They're going from one place to another, and this is also making these places more vulnerable. So at the same time that more people are talking about Green New Deal and they're talking about some level of transition, this is getting the markets really excited. So even before the Deutsche Bank report, KPMG was, for example, offering particular services to the industry to prepare for COP26, to make sure that they would know which were the best places where they could invest, and giving this whole outlook for investors. And this is basically what the Bill Gates book is about. It is about how to prepare your investment portfolio for this new era. And you will be quite like a lot more honest if a lot of the reviews that pop up of this book actually talked about this reasoning, this rationale behind the book, right? And what's happening right now is like this. People are eyeing, for example, more iron ore, copper, cobalt, nickel. There's also lithium, obviously, a series of rare earth minerals. And obviously there is conversation about, well, these do come with environmental consequences. But where are these impacts? The majority of the impacts are going to be in the global south, or in certain cases, China itself. So China being, China being at the forefront of this, and at the same time, China extracting there and in other places. Sorry, I'm asthmatic, so sometimes this happens. I think better now. So based on this conversation, we're dealing with a situation where we are already dealing with the problem of ecological imperialism. So these natural resources are being extracted from one place, taken to another, and even sometimes, as the Coldplay conversation there illustrates quite well, something that also happens is like this: we're going to tell you how to protect your forests. We're going to stamp a $sign on it, and then this is going to be used for us elsewhere, so we can keep doing whatever we want to do, and then you're going to have to abide by this. And this is being used, this kind of system is actually being used even by the far right in Latin America. So the Bolsonaro government just came out with a huge Adopt a Park program that actually extends, is not the whole adopt a park, you and individual help to keep up our parks, which is already problematic because they should be part of the public service, but also corporations, you can do this. But Brazil, for a really long time, and Latin America in general, they have been rejecting all of these red plus solutions, these ideas of putting a price on the forest in other places. And now the far right is just embracing this together with some like the more liberal side of the climate change movement that just thinks whatever it takes so we can stop deforestation. But whatever it takes usually comes at the cost of indigenous communities being more vulnerable. It comes at the cost of making partnerships with governments that are also bleeding people in other ways. They are also connected with promoting more industrial extractivism. And to close up, what I want to talk about here is that we also have a problem with how the left is complicit in the system. And this is very common when we're analyzing Latin America and what we call the pink tide governments. So talking about this like progressive wave of governments that we had throughout the continent before this more recent right-wing comeback. So we're talking about Lula in Brazil, we're talking about Rafael Correa in Ecuador, we're talking about Kirchner in Argentina, and we're also talking about Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, and so forth. What's important for us to understand here is that this brings us into a conversation about development. We need to talk about development or alternatives to development per se. And this is a conversation that never gets into COP. And this is also a conversation that's missing from a lot of our climate justice spaces. Because most of the time, for example, there's a lot of this excitement about, yes, let's do a Green New Deal. So for example, the European Green New Deal. I'm currently in Vienna right now for a couple of months doing research as a postdoctoral fellow, and the conversation around the European Green New Deal gets people very excited. But guess what? The European Green New Deal is getting the markets excited, and it's also pushing for this whole system of a commodity super cycle, thinking that we're going to be able to value this more, especially because there's a tendency for fossil fuel prices to keep rising. But what happens to the places where we're extracting these things from? And they might say, oh, no, but the governments are letting us do it because there are leftist governments there as well, and they're also promoting the same kind of thing. And South Africa, as Patrick has mentioned, but Latin America and other places, there's a tendency to see the extractive industry as a powerhouse that you need to keep investing in it. The a little more radical left would say that, well, it needs to be public at least, and then we're going to be able to extract this and make sure that all of the royalties, everything is with us. We're not actually fighting and competing with countries from abroad about what we're actually gaining from it. But there's little conversation, or actually insufficient conversation, about what this means in terms of saying, well, perhaps let's not exploit all of that oil. Yes, let's keep it public, because public means we can control it, but let's not take it all out. Let's not look into the pre-salt layer in Brazil and say, look at that, we need it to be public because that means 100 years of energy sovereignty for Brazil. And usually when I'm talking to people in the Brazilian left about this, I'm like, wow, you're thinking 100 years, like what planet is going to be left if we use all of this pre-salt oil in 100 years? And usually the answer that I get is just like this. Well, the rich countries, they already got their chance. Now it's our time. So there's this idea that to develop in many places is to try to catch up in this game of capitalist development, of capitalist growth. And that's also really present in the left in most of the places. And this is why eco-socialists, we face a really particular challenge here, because sometimes I feel like we're really between a rock and a hard place, because what we see right here is that we're trying to make a stance against green capitalism and this type of agreements and this type of discourses that don't acknowledge the role of capitalist growth in this system and in the emissions and the problems that we're facing today. But at the same time, even in leftist circles, particularly because we're dealing with different ideas about development and different ideas about job creation, is also really hard to make sure that we can actually ecologize the areas. And this requires us to be very careful at this moment, because even, for example, we hope that in Brazil we get rid of Bolsonaro. We hope we get rid of Bolsonaro before next year. We need to get rid of Bolsonaro for yesterday, actually. But prospects of perhaps a leftist government coming out with Lula after Bolsonaro are already trying to get us back into the same system of very hard extractive industries as before. And with the commodity super cycle, that's going to mean economic growth. And then it's going to say, see, this is what works. And we're never going to be moving beyond the moderate left, and we're still going to be digging our own graves. So it is about dealing with something that is unequal responsibilities. So obviously the responsibilities in the global north and in the global south, they are different. And that's why we need to talk about climate debt. But it's also shared responsibilities when our leaderships or organizations are not doing their jobs of being radical enough to push for a completely different agenda. And this is our role as eco-socialists. Our role as eco-socialists is to basically fire productive critique in different directions, and even bringing the hard conversations, about the commons and the commodification and perhaps even the growth in some areas, and try to make sure that that comes back into the vernacular of the left and allows us to think of something that actually will move us beyond COP, and perhaps with social movements and with the public sector, we can be more empowered to say that, for example, oh yes, look at that European Green New Deal. They want to become a lot greener and they want our resources, but no, we're not going to extract all of that. We're going to extract some for what we need, and this is what's left for you guys. So that means you're going to have to manage your mode of living, your mode of production, and this perhaps can help us lay the foundations for like a post-capitalist society, hopefully an eco-socialist one. That's it.
Very much, Patrick and Sabrina, for those very stimulating introductions of your thought on these subjects. But one thing that's coming through is that we have a brilliant critique from the eco-socialist perspective of what's going on and what the capitalist plans are and how the UN functions in really a sinister way to sort of create legitimation for continued rule of the capitalist system. And we know that some kind of breakthrough to socialism is what's going to be required to really deal with the climate crisis. And I think one of the questions that I'm going to ask you, I have a million questions, but I'm going to stick with the $64 trillion question, which is how do we build the movement? How do we respond? Aside from putting forward our eco-socialist principles and critiquing what's going on and promoting slogans like system change, not climate change, behind our backs and carrying banners, how do we have actually a strategy to move forward in our communities, in our nations, in our and globally? What are the most positive developments that you see in terms of that? And I'll just say that here in the States, we're struggling to turn the eco-socialist politics into an actual working class movement. We're a small segment of the overall left at this point, growing, but still often not listened to. And there's still growthism, which is, I think, the North's version of developmentalism. And it's for continued, neo conservative, really, politics in the long run, neoliberal politics. And so, is there a mobilization? Is there an organization that's going on that you can talk about in South Africa and in Brazil? And I'll let you go with that. Who would like to speak? Patrick.
Unmute. Okay. Yes, very quickly, if I can start by continually finding hope and inspiration in anti-capitalist struggle. So one was against the corporates that kept apartheid in power. We didn't think we'd overthrow apartheid back when the ANC was unbanned. It was one of those, maybe the Soviet Union's collapse, but it was really a capitalist crisis that had come from a BDS, the first boycott, divestment, sanctions. Have to really, get the Israel BDS up as fast as we can again now. But the South African BDS was along with the local protest, so critical in doing exactly what you're asking, Ted, for us to do globally. And there was internationalization. It was the globalization of people against globalization of capital. And then that, in turn, gave us a second opportunity, that very formula, which was in fighting AIDS by demanding from pharmaceutical companies generic medicines. And when that was achieved, even against the kind of US government, but even South Africa's government was AIDS denialist. And against Big Pharma and against the WTO, just the same site right now, the trade-related intellectual property system, and all the points Sabrina was making about the earlier efforts to decommodify and to get waivers on IP for solar, those were achieved 20 years ago. And the result here was the life expectancy went from 52 to 65. A third, just in passing, I'm a teacher at a university, and our student activists won for 90% of the kids, the working class kids, free tertiary education. I'm hoping, unlike, I suppose, Brazil, Sabrina, you'll probably tell us more, but those kind of strategies really are class and anti-capitalist victories. I know Brazil's a little different with its free tertiary. It seems to me those are the sort of building blocks that give our comrades who are trying to make the links, just as in the States and Brazil, between a very defensive and sometimes labor aristocratic trade union scene, very tied into defending existing jobs, because they know we haven't got anything on offer as a just transition to really shift people out of coal-fired power plants, out of smelters, out of high carbon intensity activities into the sectors we need. And I agree with the commentators like Philip Owen or Jean. There are big problems with renewables, especially dependence on lithium. The renewable strategies here, by the way, that might work a little bit better is pump storage, which can draw down from a nice bright day after pumping water uphill, create energy when the sun isn't shining, or molten salt to capture solar. So there's non-lithium modes of storage that's going to be critical, I think. But the other aspect of that is here in South Africa, but everywhere, looking at the demand side of the high carbon intensive activities. And here it would be something called an energy intensive users group, about 35 companies that chew up 40% of the electricity. And I think there I come back to Sabrina's point. In an eco-socialist perspective, we want to plan properly the resource use and not allow unequal exchange, unequal ecological exchange. And to do so, I think, would require us to turn off the electricity to some of the major consumers, those that produce, Coca-Cola cans with aluminium, with aluminum, massively carbon-intensive smelting process, right? And those are the sorts of things that I think, to someone like Philip and to Jean, who want to see a much bigger agenda on energy than just more renewables to replace existing. No, we'd want to actually plan the allocation of those. And that, to me, would be the set of maybe quick replies to the comrades. But Ted's asking a strategic question, and very quickly, the scale politics that would take us from sites of struggle in national settings to the global scale is a long way away, isn't it? To get the kind of power balance that allowed a Montreal Protocol to ban CFCs would be wonderful if we could envisage somehow, out of the existing ruins of the COP, some recreation of a power. But Sabrina's right. I mean, this is this very detailed analysis she has. And I saw it very closely when we hosted the COP17 in Durban, South Africa. And we tried, and I fear our comrades in Glasgow aren't quite at that level of, let me say, cynicism yet, to call the reformist reforms that strengthen the system, the carbon trading, the offsets, the false solutions, to call those out. To me, Sabrina's right. The strategy of the eco-socialist has got to be the ruthless critique of capitalist and imperialist and sub-imperialist climate policy. And then the rebuilding, the scale politics that bring us back from local and national struggles to the global. I think that lies ahead. I don't have a quick, easy strategy, comrades, but I hope you can contribute to the debate. But we're still fairly early on in that reconstruction of our eco-socialist sensibilities, much less the alliances we need to bring them into the movements.
Yeah, I think that one of our challenges is definitely the fact that we're behind. We are really behind where we should be right now. This is not completely our fault, because we do know that there have been a lot of setbacks within the left itself, having to deal with like climate deniers, not only in the Trump scenario. In Brazil, sometimes we even hear that, and it is shocking. It is shocking, but I've heard a few times that climate change is not real. It's just an imperialist plot to make sure that Brazil never develops. So it is amazing that this is actually something that people believe in, but this happens. So we have a lot of setbacks, but I do think that there is something happening. So just as Patrick mentioned something about BDS right now, right? I feel like the narrative is shifting around Palestine right now. Like the past weeks, that have been amazing around this, and also for the past 2 years, the narrative is starting to shift around the need to move more urgently around climate change. So this is actually going at the basis of certain movements. Talking about Latin America specifically, that we have historical movements that have been very active in their own agenda, for example, agrarian reform, or anti-industrial mining, or connected, for example, to indigenous land settlement and against indigenous genocide. And now these movements are ever closer to each other, finding these connections, figuring out that, well, something that unites all of us here is definitely fighting climate change, because this is in the interest of every single one of these movements, of these stakeholders. So I think there's something brewing, something positive brewing. And I am very, very excited about the idea of making sure that whenever we're talking about the public sector, the climate change conversation pops in. So the government in Brazil is selling Eletrobras, the Brazilian electricity company, and saying that it's going to be cheaper. That's saying that, well, you're not going to pay as much in your power bill anymore. So obviously a lie. And now they're selling Petrobras biofuels. And obviously there's critiques that we can bring into the conversation about biofuels. For example, like I used to do research on biofuel land grabs in the African continent. And we know that happens in Brazil as well. So there are things like that. But for example, Petrobras Biofuels in 2009 onwards actually had a partnership with family agriculture, with small farmers and peasants, to try to make sure that they wouldn't be gathering the grains for the biofuels from large agribusiness. This was something really novel in the system, and it only ever happened because it was connected to the public sector. So if we are not fighting these pushes for privatization or opening these companies up for IPOs and the financial market, things are only going to get harder. So part of what I'm saying that could be helpful is actually making sure that whenever there's a plea for solidarity coming from workers everywhere, and they are really worried about losing their jobs, be it to neoliberalization or to a green transition, to make sure, no, we are with you, because if we are with you and we make this into a huge defense of the public sector, we have a lot more room to guarantee they have good jobs. We have a report that came out recently by GIESE, and in Brazil, it's like this institution in Brazil that does really good economic statistics about what we need. And the majority of green jobs are actually really bad jobs. They don't pay very well. It's really long hours, and you don't have the same benefits. So you have people that are qualified, and when they look into these greener jobs, they go and they say, no, I'm just going to keep going to oil and gas, because that's where I get better benefits and I can actually afford healthcare for my family or something like that. But why is this happening? Because these green jobs are in the private sector. And this is the problem with part of this conversation. So we should be talking about salvaging jobs in the public sector in a longer conversation about how we're planning our production. And if we're not talking about planning production and the use of these resources, we're just going to be going from like commodity boom to, to commodity bust to commodity boom, which has kind of been the trend for the countries in the global south for a really long time right now. And this has led us absolutely nowhere. And there's absolutely no way that the greenwashing around it right now is actually going to be successful, because we do know that the benefits are still very much in other places. And that's why I think that's something that's really powerful, is when we make sure that anti-imperialist movements are not just in the countries being affected by imperialism. When we have anti-imperialist voices in the places where, well, for example, in Canada, when it's Canadian companies intervening in Bolivia to mine in Bolivia, and you have people in Canada fighting Belo Sun, for example, this helps a lot the people in Bolivia. Rather than just being the people in Bolivia feeling powerless around it. So making sure that our internationalism connects around how these resources are being distributed, extracted, and who's getting the benefits out of it, even if it means it's, well, but it's for our solar panels, we need to be a little bit more critical of that, because it could be way too many solar panels in one place, and ecosystems and communities absolutely destroyed in other places.
Before I turn this over to Maura, I'm going to ask one question that you could answer briefly, which is there a demand that we should be pressing locally and globally, organizing around, that is on the gathering at COP26? Have you seen a movement towards something that should be put forward? And I'm thinking specifically of what you were just talking about, Sabrina, in terms of the need to be focusing on the economy that's to follow. That if workers do not see a future, this will not turn into a working class movement. It will be a movement that about finance and about NGOs and so on, trying to put pressure on banks and trying to establish tax and dividends and things like that. Whereas what we really know we need is a movement. So I'm kind of curious, is there something that you think we can build around there? And keep it brief, because we have a lot of questions that are coming from the audience.
Well, I'll go quickly first, just to say the few points I've made, I think are still outstanding. There's a little bit of progress here and there, but I just put them in the chat box as sort of transitional demands. But look, the overarching agenda has to be questioning the legitimacy of global elites who are, driving us off the cliff. And I think where Greta Thunberg and where, street radicals, where the Blockadia comrades who are trying to block fossil fuels, they have a much greater advantage than those who are on the inside. And one last metaphor I got from working once with Jesse Jackson, the divisions of labor desperately needed are between the tree shakers outside, those I just mentioned, and the jam makers, if there are any inside. And it's really the encouragement of those who delegitimize that I think those NGOs or the big greens or anybody who really wants to see any progress, they have to consider much more seriously. The typical response, and I remember this so clearly from Durban 2011, was just to ignore the little pinpricks of climate justice activism, even though we had one of the biggest marches ever there, 10,000 people. And the dilemma is, how do we get those insiders to acknowledge that their strength will be greater the more we can delegitimize the likes of John Kerry. I mean, this is still the dilemma of the neoliberal corporate agenda from the US that is going to take over the COP. And I think being prepared to delegitimize it from the outset, Ted, and maybe making some of those demands I just, kind of cut and pasted into the chat box would be one way forward for that.
I think there's absolutely no way to give up on the whole conversation about a global climate strike. We do need it, but we need to make sure that the conversation about strike actually reaches workers in many different areas. It has become more popular. Obviously, Greta is connected to this about the school strikes, and the school strikes are amazing for inspiring other people, mobilizing the youth, but they don't actually stop cities. That's the reality, right? It feels like a school day off in most cities, right? So to stop cities, we need to get workers in strategic places mobilized around this. And like, it would be a dream come true for me if we actually got workers in the fossil fuel industry to strike for the climate, because this would be something that would kind of like mess up with the heads of the big guys, with the big leaders there, because it means that people are understanding that this is going to affect me as well. So this is one of the situations. The other is that I'm still very worried that a lot of these conversations about the Green New Deal are very domestic or nationalist, which is part of the problem right now, because these conversations are making sure that it's just about a new green stimulus for their economies to make sure that they keep growing, especially now that people are talking about get a Green New Deal out of the pandemic, right? So this is happening, and they're not connecting to the resources everywhere else, and this commodification of nature that happens everywhere else. And I think one way of dealing with this is kind of trying to ride the wave of the TRIPS conversation and bring this back into sharing knowledge and sharing science, sharing technology around climate change everywhere. Let's get rid of private property in that sense. And then you're going to see Bill Gates and his book get really angry about it, because he's the biggest fan of patents ever, including in the circumstances where we are. So for us, I think there's a really good opportunity. I actually wrote about something about this, but it's still sitting as a draft. I'm going to publish at some point on how to use the TRIPS conversation to get back into the whole thing about green patents, and how that has been a problem. And also it has been a problem because it's making sure that we're investing resources in useless patents as well, things that are not going to be useful for actually transitioning, or they're just going to be about, very Elon Musk-like scenarios. So for us, it's important to make sure that we move from it. So bring private property back into the conversation about COP. Challenging private property there is quite important. And they have managed to exclude it for a really long time. And we need to make sure it's back on.
Thank you.
You're muted.
I'm muted. Ted, you're muted.
Yes. I'm putting the fall of the House of Gates, an article, a link to that article that appeared in The Nation, which is really quite fascinating and it really does take up the whole issue of how billionaires are trying to shape politics in numerous ways, and while basically portraying themselves as our saviors. And there's a certain worship of these guys like Gates here in the United States. We've got to break through that, and I think that's the delegitimization that Patrick is talking about as well. So Maura, go ahead.
So don't buy the damn book. So if you want to read it, get a reviewer copy, but get it for free. So there are many conversations going on in the chat about my favorite subject, which is language and media and using the media and journalism. I'm a journalist and a journalism professor. Using independent media and breaking through the incredible corporate mainstream media, which is, you know, one of the United States' most successful exports, unfortunately. I ask people in other countries what media they're watching and reading, and almost always they come up with something that's corporate owned, not realizing it. Even in the United States, people think the so-called national public radio is a public service and that it is independent. It is not. Neither is the public broadcasting system for the television. But I mean, people proudly, liberals and progressives say to me, oh yes, I only get my news from NPR or PBS. And that is just as the same as getting it from the New York Times or Fox News or CNN. So I wonder if you can talk about, you know, we're talking about getting our ideas around and building a movement, but you can't do that without some loudspeaker. So what loudspeakers are you using, right? In System Change, Not Climate Change, and the Global Ecosocialist Network, we're talking to either confirmed eco-socialists or people who are already well on their way to being among us, but we're not big enough, and we never will be big enough with the numbers we have now unless we expand rapidly. So talk about how you can do it. I mean, it's great to teach in a classroom and you teach maybe 50 students a year and they go out and, but that we don't, you know, again, when we're looking down the barrel of a cannon, we don't have time to build understanding of movements. So how can we grab the narrative? What ideas do you have for grabbing the narrative, not just around COP26, but in general? This is, as we all have noticed, a really critical year. And COVID has given us opportunities and threats, but the opportunities will never come again the way they are right now in 2021. So I know we've only got a few minutes left for this big topic, but if you can touch on just a few thoughts about that. Patrick,
well, I'm incompetent. Sabrina, you've got a big following. You should answer first, and I have maybe one.
Yeah, I've been trying. I inadvertently became a communicator. It was not part of my plan, my life plan, but I think it's part of being an eco-socialist as well, trying to make sure people see what's going on and you're trying to find different outlets. And that's why we're here today, right? Where we're here, we're live, we're trying to get this conversation going. Something that I think is quite interesting, like for the past 4 years in Brazil, I've been leading a communication project that's now in every social media possible. It's even on TikTok nowadays, trying to get the ball rolling on a series of topics. And I find that people are becoming more receptive. This is not without its challenges, you know, that are haters and that the right wing is ruthless and all of that. But people are becoming more receptive to conversations about changing the world. It's not just about changing one thing that you do and like eat it this way and don't use plastic and things like that, but conversations that are a little bit more systemic. And I think we need to take advantage of this because this is a window of opportunity around how frustrated everyone is right now and how tired everyone is right now. People are not seeing a lot of spaces of hope, to borrow from Harvey's expression here. But something that I think is interesting is that more and more people are taking this on. So I would say that we should not, social media is controlled by corporations. We are very much held hostage by algorithms every single day. And that has been one of the challenges. There are keywords that we say, and then we go into shadow ban and things like that. But there are also communities that we can build around it and try to make sure people organize in their area around it, right? So whenever we're dealing with this, I think it's important for us to give people a path, like a little path to follow. Yes, you found this conversation interesting. So where do you look for more? Who do you talk to for more? What's around it where you live? And how can you actually get engaged, more involved, or are practical actions? As soon as you give a little bit of a roadmap, people are more likely to be engaged beyond that one particular moment where they could just be there because I'm listening to both sides of the story or something like that. So trying to get community engagement in different levels, I think is it's an important way of doing this. And I think because Laura's talking about loudspeakers, and I'm thinking now of sound bites as well. But like I've been talking a lot to my audience about let's normalize the radical, because for a really long time, you know, it was bad to be a radical again, and it's a bad word and means that you're too extremist and things like that. So the more we normalize what is radical, and that the reality is radically bad. The reality is radically killing us right now. And that means that we need to be very radical at tackling it. So I think we have some opportunities around it. And hopefully, as we win out of the pandemic, I hope so, these can also translate into people getting, you know, more face-to-face work, more mobilization, more grassroots work. And I think, again, the youth movements are a huge part of this. Not just in the schools, but mobilizing in their neighborhoods, because there's something really amazing that I found out in the past years. For example, my most recent book, which is sort of like an introductory guide to radical politics in the Anthropocene. And I have like a lot of younger people reading it, and then they read it and then they give it to their parents. And I think this is something interesting, because sometimes when people are thinking youth, they're only thinking the student movement, but youth is also this huge connection to their communities and their families. And that's why the like more young people that we have together will be available. Unfortunately, this book, just so in the chat, unfortunately, this book right now is only available in Portuguese, but the publisher is actually negotiating a deal to come out in English. So if I have more news about it, I'll let you guys know later on.
And perhaps I could just add, I know it's that Sabrina's the guru, so I defer to all the things she just said. But the other point I know she's agreeing with is the movement building that transcends the typical in the silo or NGOized sort of specializations, and does more or less what the phrase "this changes everything" of Naomi Klein, a great eco-socialist, has argued, that connecting the dots and making local and global connections is critical. Making labor to community to environment to, again, demand the just transitions, and particularly in countries like Brazil and South Africa and much poorer ones, the financing through reparations. Black Lives Matter has been so powerful in making that a reasonable demand to make reparations payments for the historic wrongs. And the climate debt is going to be one of the critical ones that I hope all eco-socialists can continue to emphasize, along with unequal ecological exchange more generally. It's profound, it's trillions, we can go into calculations. And it's in that sense, I'll just give you the one last example. Yesterday, our foreign minister, her name is Naledi Pandor, she announced, she told Reuters, that now what we've been fearing is imminent. That is, that the South African army will go into northern Mozambique to protect Total, ExxonMobil, Eni, China National Petroleum Corporation, and they would hope also Sasol, South Africa's former state-owned and now privatized oil company. Why? $128 billion of gas in the offshore Rovuma Strait, just offshore northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado. An Islamic insurgency that's grounded in very profound anger at society's exclusion from the wealth of that area, rubies, timber, minerals, but now particularly the huge outflow. And it's just been so inspiring to me that several groups transcended the typical, let's say, middle-of-the-road NGO concern about the area that's always expressed. And instead of saying, no, we need to actually leave that gas under the straits, don't extract it. And what the comrades need in northern Mozambique to withstand whatever pressures from Islamic insurgency, from Mozambique army, and from Total, they need the climate debt. They need a reparations for the damage. In fact, 2 years ago, massive cyclones, Cyclone Kenneth, 225K per hour winds. And they need those reparations as an alternative. Now we have one wonderful example, Yasuni National Park, but it failed. And it failed for interesting reasons we should get into, particularly because, just as Sabrina said, the pink tide of Rafael Correa tended towards Chinese oil extractivism instead of keeping that oil, $10 billion worth, underground. The demand was for a payment, a climate debt that the North as a down payment would make so that Ecuador and the state wouldn't need to extract that oil. To me, that's the right sort of formula. And then the question is, how would you do it? How would you implement it? We have one or two interesting pilots. To me, those are some of the things about communicating, not really because I'm any good at memes, but particularly because the movements are doing the connect the dot. They're anti-sub-imperialist, anti-militarist, and they're incredibly aware now in a place like northern Mozambique of the injustices of a neo-colonial arrangement that will be amplified by fossil fuels. And to see the trade unions in South Africa with the social movements, the feminist movements, Women is one of the great ones, Acción Ecológica likewise, making these kind of connections in the Andes out of Quito. These are really inspiring ways to make a much richer version of climate justice that puts economic justice, and I think logically must lead us to an eco-socialist, an orientation to planning how we arrange our society.
That's great, and there are just so many questions left unanswered and so much conversation left to have. I wonder if we can ask the both of you if you would be open to possibly doing a follow-up, because we have had a very rich conversation going on in the chat with people who are obviously very engaged and very worried and very terrified. So I'm going to leave you with one final question each. Will you be going to Glasgow? And if so, what will you be doing there? If not, what will you be doing instead? I know Patrick's been to many a COP and probably is done with them. He says he's failed miserably at all of them, but anyway.
Well, the failure that we experienced in Durban, we've written it up in a journal called Ephemera, is, I think, a good set of lessons about the failure to make clear what these non-reformist reforms would be, and instead the willingness to accept reformist reforms which strengthen the system, right? It's a classic problem about reformism versus a more radical perspective. But no, I won't be going. I mean, I've had a climate debt from my frequent flyer card. I live at the bottom of Africa, which is just horrendous. My 12-year-old daughter is always reminding me of this, that you got to stay put now. So that's my quick and easy answer. And COVID-19 has grounded us all. But I think the critical question that Africans are asking is, if there's going to be resurgent waves because of the lack of a COVID-19 vaccine with an intellectual property waiver, we're going to see new variants popping up all over. And then Glasgow may have to go, as middle of the year it will, into a virtual mode. Well, we're going to have potentials, but also digital divides that really prevent the proper kind of participation. Sabrina is exactly right, that this is all pre-cooked. We can imagine the likes of the Todd Stearns, right? These kind of neoliberal corporate characters in the US State Department already cooking it up. And we can imagine the ways in which our protest pressures and our delegitimization pressures are going to have to increase. And I think now we're much better at doing these kinds of seminars. So yes, to your question, Mara, let's keep doing it. Let's get new voices in, because the one critical answer that Sabrina hinted at, which we just have to build on because it's so true, is generational rage, the intergenerational debts that, Brundtland Commission 1987 gave us as our mandate to think about a planning process, an eco-socialist process to prevent the destruction of the heritage, right, of the stewardship that we owe our children and grandchildren. And that, I do think, as I get older, really stands out, that the generational rage that we desperately need to do, as Greta is doing, this delegitimization with such sophistication and clarity, that to encourage that would be the older socialists, eco-socialists function as well. Maybe don't bring me in, but bring the next generation in, Mara. But thanks, comrades.
So actual COP is actually not an option for me anymore because I don't see the point. So it's really, you go there and we have no voice in that space. Whenever you get to give a workshop or a little talk, it's just how they're trying to make sure that we listen to everyone, even the most radical activists who are always complaining about us, we let them in and things like that. So it's sort of a legitimacy game. It's hard. And the conversations around the social movements around COP that have been going on primarily with, for example, from the ground up and other initiatives, they're happening mostly online, right? So I don't think we're at that point, but I obviously think at some point in a world post-pandemic, hopefully not the way that not so many variants, I hope. But it's really hard to deal with this right now. Things are quite unpredictable, especially when Brazil and India are brewing new variants as we speak, and South Africa as well, right? So situation is quite worrisome in certain places. But at some point, we need to actually go and bust COP, right? Which is something our demonstrations never managed to do. We kind of need to go Seattle on it at some point, and that would be the way.
Could I pick up, because Michael Hart at Duke University, sort of autonomous Marxist theorist, he said, look, it's actually not really only about keeping these guys out, but it's blocking them in. And feminists in Liberia did so to try to end their civil war successfully, actually. Some of them won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. So something that is as disruptive, but in a delegitimization mode, like, women lying down, sometimes naked, to block the men in until the deal that's required was done. A great model. But I think the general question of what will continue to delegitimize, and that means we often have to have very tough debates with our NGO, sort of eco-modernizationists. And maybe there's a dialectic. David Schwartzman here on the call is allowing me to write in Science and Society this next issue about dialectics between eco-modernization and climate justice to get us there. But very, very tough debates about carbon trading, offsets, false solutions, net zero nonsense lie immediately ahead, and eco-socialists have to be there. Amandla.
I got you read Patrick's paper. It's really good.
So this has been really an extraordinary meeting of minds and conversation. And it will be posted on our YouTube channel, which is at bit.ly/system change on YouTube, all lowercase. It's got to be lowercase or it'll get screwed up. So that's where the webinars can be found, and we'll have it up by tomorrow. For those who weren't able to make it to today's webinar, I know that there's a lot of interest. I can tell from glancing at the chat that there's a lot of excitement about how this conversation went. And I personally have been a little distracted by some various things beeping on me, and will be watching that myself again to take in some of what flew by. Thank you both, Sabrina and Patrick, for your contributions today. And with that, we'll call it a wrap. Take care, everyone. Amandla.